Hello, and welcome to today's ACM Tech Talk. This webcast is part of ACM's commitment to lifelong learning and professional development, serving a global membership of nearly 100,000 computing professionals and students. My name is Juan Miguel de Hoya. Currently, I serve as a project officer for the AI for Good team at the International Telecommunication Union, the United Nations agency specializing in information and communication technologies. I'm an ACM member, and in my spare time, also, I'm part of the ACM Practitioners Board, the ACM Professional Development Committee, the ACM Future Computing Academy, and the ACM SIGGRAPH Strategy Group. To learn more about my background, check out the bio window on your screen. So, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with ACM or what it has to offer, here is more information. ACM offers educational and professional development resources that bolster skills and enhance career opportunities. Our members can stay competitive in the constantly changing world of computing with a range of ACM Learning Center resources at learning.acm.org. You can see some of the highlights on your screen. ACM recognizes the role of computing in driving the innovations that sustain competitiveness in the global environment. To that end, ACM provides timely computing information published by ACM, including communications of the ACM and the Q magazines, access to the ACM Digital Library, the world's most comprehensive database of computing literature, international conferences that draw leading experts on the broad spectrum of computing topics, support for education and research, including curriculum development, teacher training, the ACM Turing and ACM Prize in Computing Awards, and the updated ACM Code of Ethics, a collection of principles and guidelines designed to help computing professionals make ethically responsible decisions in professional practice. ACM enables its members to solve critical problems using new technology that enriches our lives and advances our society in the digital age. So before we get started, I'd like to quickly mention a few housekeeping items shown on the slide in front of you. First, the slide will advance automatically throughout the event. On the bottom panel, you will find some additional widgets and resources. If you are experiencing problems with the slides or audio, press the F5 key in Windows, Command R if you're on a Mac, or refresh the browser on a mobile device. You can close and relaunch the presentation. To control the volume, adjust the master volume on your computer. If you have any questions during the talk, please type them into the Q&A box at any time and click the Submit button. I'll organize the questions as Ed and Richard speak, and they'll reserve time at the end of the presentations to address them. This session is being recorded and will be archived. You will receive an automatic email notification when it becomes available. And check out learning.acm.org for updates on this and other upcoming webcasts. At the end of the presentation, you'll see a survey open up on your screen. Please take a minute to fill it out and help us improve our tech talks. You may also open the link to the survey at any time from the resources window. You can use the Facebook and Twitter widgets on the bottom panel to share the presentation link with your friends, as well as tweet comments and questions using the hashtag ACMLearning. We'll be watching for your tweets. We also have a community discourse page to continue the discussion after this webcast, including questions we won't be able to get to during the Q&A session. Today's presentation is past, present, and future of computer graphics, perspective from two frontrunners on the inception and evolution of CG. Ed Catmull is a co-founder of Pixar Animation Studios and serves as the president of Pixar for 33 years, while also serving as the president of Walt Disney Animation Studio for 13 of those years. Previously, he was vice president of the computer division of Lucasfilms Ltd. Limited, where he managed development in the areas of computer graphics, video editing, video games, and digital audio. Ed is one of the architects of the RenderMan rendering software, which has been used in over 90% of Academy Award winners for visual effects over the past 20 years. He has also been honored with 5 Academy Awards, including 2 Oscars for his work and a Lifetime Achievement Award. Ed is active in several professional organizations. He is a dedicated participant in ACM SIGGRAPH for nearly 40 years and is a member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the Visual Effects Society. He has received numerous awards from these organizations. Last month, Ed shared the 2019 ACM AM Turing Award with Pat Haranahan. Richard Chuang served as a co-founder of PDI DreamWorks from 1982 through 2008. He pioneered the studio's proprietary animation system, for which he received his first Academy Technical Achievement Award in 1998, and his second in 2016. As a forerunner in computer animation and visual effects for both animated and live-action films, Chuang's credits range from directing commercials to winning an Emmy Award for graphic design. He has 16 live-action film credits as visual effects supervisor. While at DreamWorks Animation, he led efforts to set up production around the globe, mostly notably in China and India. Chuang has served on the conference and strategic advisory committees for ACM SIGGRAPH, as foreign advisor for the Beijing Film Academy's Advanced Innovation Center for Future Visual Entertainment, and an adjunct professor for AR/VR at Cogswell College. Most recently, he's the founder of D1N0, a startup leveraging creativity and innovation, and currently advises tech startups across the field, from biomedical engineering to AR applications using the latest technologies using CG and ML. For more on Ed and Richard's legendary career as an accomplishment, please check out the bio widget on your screen. Ed and Richard, without further ado, take it away.
I'm sorry, Richard, we can't hear you. Would you mind refreshing?
Oh, sorry. First, I want to give a shout out to all the people out there who are risking their life to make us safe. And I know a lot of you are probably resting comfortably at home, but there's a group of people out there working very hard to make us live a better life going into the future. So big thank you to everybody. And Ed, welcome to this talk. And me and Ed goes back a long time, and this is an opportunity for us to relive some of that history and hopefully convey a perspective that will enlighten not just you, but ourselves in terms of the state of CG. Welcome, Ed.
Well, thank you, Richard. I agree. We're all locked away here and realizing there are people out there who aren't putting their lives in danger. And actually, there's a connection I make, because right now we're living through something, even though there were warning signs that were given. And what it reminds me of is when the Soviets first launched the missile around the world, and everybody understood, from the generals down to people who were working in stores or farms or wherever, that this was serious, even though we were in the middle of the Cold War. And the response to that launched 50 years of progress. And there have been warning signs since then, and my own hope is that this pandemic, likewise, is real enough to people that it will launch the next generation of innovation and change. I grew up at this time when the response from the government was the formation of ARPA, and the principle there was they didn't want to get surprised again. So they funded people in various universities with different focuses, and I happened to be at Utah, where the focus was in graphics, which is also where I grew up. And it was rather amazing to have people like Ivan Sutherland or Dave Evans, but also a whole variety of professors that came together, and some incredibly amazing students. Said Alan Kay and John Warnock and Jim Clark, these people that helped form various foundations in the computer graphics and the computer science world. So at that time, they're making pictures out of polygons, and each step forward was to make the polygons look better. And what I wanted to do was to make it so that we could actually display curved surfaces. originally Ivan actually wanted me to figure out how to bend polygons. And so I was bending polygons, and I realized there were fundamental flaws with that. I worked out ways of quickly displaying curved surfaces, and I realized at the time that the only way I could display them was to have a depth buffer, or the Z buffer, as I called it, to figure out what was in front. But also it meant I had a mathematical description of a surface so that textures could be mapped onto it. Now, as a side note, I was thinking about all different kinds of curved surfaces, and I generated a new kind of surface for one of my dissertation. And when I gave it to my professor, he actually threw it back at me and did this shit. It wasn't until later when we then wrote the paper Subdivision Surfaces. But Utah was this phenomenally great time where the students worked together, and the relationship and the energy was so great that I came away feeling this is the kind of environment that I want to have going forward in the future. So I left Utah wanting to make the first computer animated film, and also wanting to replicate that kind of environment. And I figured it would take 10 years to get to the first feature film. I was off by a factor of 2. It actually took 20 years. But that was the start. And then I went off to New York Tech. And at New York Tech, the head of the school wanted to be the new Walt Disney. He came in every single day to the lab and said, I'm not trying to be Walt Disney. It was continually on his mind. He was funding us to computer graphics, and initially it was 2D, because they had a 2D studio there. I wrote an animation program called Tween, but in the meantime, I was doing research into motion blur, which was necessary for making film, and doing more 3D renderers, and others were doing 3D renderers at the same time. And so Jim Clark and Lance Williams and Frank Crow and Fred Park, all these people joined in this group as we tried to, and that's all we were doing, is Alex was funding this research group to advance technology. Now the other thing, because and I brought Utah, was everything that we came up with. And Alex sure was fine with that. Found from there, including up through Lucasfilm, that we published everything, and that some of the people who wanted to make animated films were keeping their ideas secret. For me, it didn't make any sense because we were so far away from the goal that the play was not to have the secret idea. The play was to get the best people and have them come and join. I didn't care about the particular ideas. I cared about getting the right people. And in '77 is when Star Wars came out. And George recognized that one of the things that enabled Star Wars to work, in addition to the story, was they used the computers to control the rocket ships, and they got their motion blur. And these people were the ultimate masters in the filmmaking process and optical printers, which enabled them to do that. So from George's point of view, technology enabled advances in filmmaking. So he hired me to come in and bring technology into the film industry, in particular with graphics, digital audio, and video editing. So we formed groups in each one of those areas. And I also learned something from New York Tech. I had a management theory, 2/3 of which worked, 1/3 of which was a complete crock. So Lucasfilm was an opportunity for a restart and to have more organization. So I slowly started this process from going from conceiving myself as technical only, never wanting to manage anything, to becoming more and more of a manager, but at the same time trying to do technology and algorithm development because that was my self-conception. But I could also observe what was happening to the people around me, how they treated me as we changed. And so it was a slow evolution. But at Lucasfilm, we had this goal to make films that were so complex they could be used in feature films. And the state of the art for polygons at the time was around 40,000 polygons. So Rob Cook and Lauren Carpenter and I got together and we wanted to rethink rendering. And the notion was we're dividing the subdivision surface, or the subdivision surface up into little tiny micropolygons, and we wanted to handle 80 million of them. That was our calculation. I have no idea why we didn't round it up to 100 million, which we should have done. But we wanted to be way ahead of what was the state of the art to force ourselves to think about things in a different way.
Okay.
And we had a competition.
Before we jump into the 80s, maybe we should, I have a few questions. I think everybody probably have similar questions. This one very important one for me is, how did you get started in graphics in the first place? I will tell my story, but I want to hear yours. And how, even before when you were a kid, before you went to college, like what were your motivation that got you involved in graphics?
Well, as a kid, I did a lot of drawing. I was, for my age, a good artist. I wanted to be an animator, completely enthralled by Disney. But at the same time, another iconic figure was Einstein. So these were the two iconic figures growing up. And as I got near the end of high school, I couldn't see what the next step was in art or animation because there were no schools whatsoever. So when I went to college, I switched over into physics.
Okay.
And in about the junior year, I took my first computer course and completely got caught up in it, programming on cards, having the shared printer, figuring out how I could cheat and use it when the rest of the class had to only submit 2 batches per day.
Okay.
I'd taken a lot of classes, so I ended up getting 2 degrees. So in the 4 years I'd taken so many courses, I had 5 years worth of credits. So I got 2 degrees, one in computer science and one in physics. And then I went off and worked in Boeing, and I did their first computer graphics driver for their printers. And then Boeing collapsed. They laid off 50,000 people. So I returned to graduate school, and I sneaked into the graduate program there. And the first class was Ivan Sutherland's on computer graphics. And it wasn't that, it was just a class to take. But I took that when I realized, holy cow, computer graphics and computer science, and you can use it to make art. So the class project was to do that, my left hand, and have it move around and write a little animation program for it, as well as the rendering program. And I did everything from scratch with this thing. I didn't use any of the packages that they had, which are based around objects that were too simple. And I was just hooked. That was it. It's like, okay, how do I make it better? How do I get the curved surfaces? How do I move them? How do I animate them? And it was like being at the front of the Easter egg hunt.
Well, that's actually a good lead-in to how I got started. I'll give a very short synopsis of my story. And then they'll sync up with it, and you will see very quickly. I was an immigrant. I came to the U.S. In 1968. My mom brought us here, a single mom, who was an entrepreneur. And ever since a kid, unlike most tiger mom, she taught me always follow my passion, never stop learning. Not once in my life did my mom ever told me to be a doctor or engineer like most Asian moms. But she just always embraced that I want to do things that I want to do. So when I was in 10th grade, I really loved art. I wanted to be a medical illustrator. Here's some drawings from my 10th grade class. And at that point, I go, wow, I can use my passion of art to help people. That's what I set out to do when I was very young. And I came from a very traditional background. These are some of my painting when I was a kid. So I came from a background of traditional artwork. And so given that, I really didn't have much exposure coming from Hong Kong at that age and then growing up in Sacramento. But I got hit the computer bug back in 1976. I convinced my mom, that's an even better story. I went to a summer science program in 1974 where it's called SSP, and I highly recommend it for young kids. And they had me trying to figure out how to track an asteroid using a telescope and calculate the orbital parameter. So back then it was all done with, big calculator. But I broke into the school computer room. They had a PDP-8, and I got exposed to computer at night, sneaking into this computer room and booting it up, learning to booting it up from paper tape, and learned what a computer was. After that, I built my first computer in 1976, the one you see on the right, a SOL-20, one of the earliest microcomputer. And then through college, I learned to program ALGOL on the Bureau BFIX 6700, which is a big computer. And this slide will hopefully change. Yeah, okay. Then you get exposed to computer graphics, but I had no idea. No lesson. The school at that point had no computer graphics class. In fact, computer science wasn't even in engineering. Computer science was part of the math department. So then during my college year, I also went out and I painted a mural in a bank in New York City, coming from an art background. So I thought for sure my career was going to be in art. This was painting, my uncle was a watercolorist, so I painted a 56-foot mural, which is still there in New York City on Canal Street. And this was in 1977. So I came out of college with an engineering degree because I actually wanted to be a graduate student, started graduate work in biomedical engineering. Because back then I had this idea in 1979 that you can use image processing to identify DNA sequences from a blot test. Turns out that was way before it was really practical. So I was so frustrated by the technology, not able to do it. So I dropped out and ended up in the HP RF and microwave lab in engineering. Again, no real exposure to computer graphics. And I was working in a space where, actually it's a funny story because I had the engineering desk closest to Bill and Dave Packard's office in Palo Alto. So it was right before they retired. So I had a chance to overlap with some of the legends in Silicon Valley. But then this happened. At HP, they were beaming through microwave classes from Berkeley. And as engineer, who were treated very well back then at HP, we had access to these classes. And there was this strange class about computer graphics that was being transmitted over microwave. And that year, I happened to bought one of the first VHS deck ever sold. And I actually pirated this class so I can watch them over and over because they weren't recording them back then. And that's when I learned all the fundamentals of computer graphics, some of the most notable people at that point. Ed, Jim, Alvy, Lauren, and they were all participants in this class. In fact, with the permission of Ed and Jim, I actually put these series of classes that are now on YouTube. So you can look for this on class, the CS 292 class. And that's when I learned computer graphics, and that's how I got into the field. And then when I still crossed paths with Ed the first time in the SIGGRAPH in Boston, 1982. That's where our paths start crossing and been in parallel in many ways since then. So, and then that's how I got started with PDI, because of that class that gave me the foundation that led me to felt comfortable working in computer graphics. So let's kill the slide here. Oh, sorry. So Ed, do you remember the first time I met you in person in the hallway in Boston in the hotel? I just rendered my first picture. I came up to you and say, look, I made a picture and I follow your advice. You told us on your class that if you're going to ever write a render again, anybody who wants to write a renderer, make sure you think about anti-aliasing from the get-go. And I followed your advice and I wrote my first render. That render was completed started in 1982, which I show you the picture. And actually, I heard they used it until 2012. So that's when we first met in person.
That's a good run record.
Yeah.
And you had anti-aliasing in it.
Yes. It was a scanline algorithm. Because don't forget, we first wrote on a PDP-1144 computer, the first computer we got. Turns out that's not a good computer for computer graphics, because we only had 128K of memory. Okay, for people in today's world, that's totally irrelevant, right? But I wrote the renderer, and me and Glenn Entis wrote the animation software on the PP11, which has very little memory because the address space is only 64K. So we learned to be very resourceful from the get-go. But the picture I showed you actually came off that machine.
Yeah, DEC was very important in our history at that time. We went through other PDP-11s, and then the first, or their next generation was the VAX 11780, which we had at New York Tech, and then we got the newer version at Lucasfilm when we started there. And we kept trying to use as much technology as we could, but there were other people trying to, and actually bought a Cray computer and then a connection machine. And from my point of view, this made no sense whatsoever.
Yeah. I still remember the day when they announced they bought a digital production, announced they bought a Cray. And me and Carl and Glenn came back from NCGA, which is the conference where they announced it, and felt like, boy, we might as well go out of business because we were a self-started company. Carl Rosendahl, Glenn Entis, and I started PDI. And we didn't have outside funding. You know, we didn't have a George Lucas paying for stuff, so we were living on a shoestring. When we heard that somebody bought a Cray XMP, we thought, oh my God, they're going to render everything in the world, and we can never compete with that. But then
I had the opposite view.
Yeah.
My view was they just spent $10 million, and we calculated that the amount of compute power it would take to do a feature film was 100 Cray 1 computers. So since we all knew about Moore's Law at the time, I just thought, they blew their wad, and they can't possibly do what the goal is. So let's keep working on the algorithms and the techniques, and the cost will come down. So we never blew the money. Our most expensive machine was the DEC, the VAX 11780, and we never tried to go beyond it.
That was actually a very interesting time, right? We came in at a time when the affordability of computer graphics just got started. And memory was just finally hitting a threshold where you can build a frame buffer. Our first frame buffer was a De Anza frame buffer, 512 by 512 by 24-bit. And it cost $64,000 back then, which is a ridiculous amount of money in today's term. And that's how we got started. And that's how I got involved in computer graphics with Carl. It's like he had a frame buffer. And I say, hey, I'll come work with you in exchange for free time on a frame buffer. And until that difference, I mean, you made a huge difference. I mean, I know a lot of friends in the industry, and they all point to your motivation for them to build better frame buffer, right? And Jim Clark in his early 80s with his group at Silicon Graphics, started to build useful frame buffer, right?
Yeah, the very first ones came from, well, there were some scanline ones at Xerox, but they were not very practical. Then Evans and Sutherland made one that was actually random access.
Huh.
And the very first one was $80,000, and the next two were $60,000. But they were only 8-bit, so you only had 256 colors instead of the 3 different colors that you had with the Anza. But we needed
You built the first full color frame buffer at NYT, right?
No, at NYT we bought it from Evans and Sutherland, and then we bought 2 more, and then we needed an interface to get to random access, so we had them build a special interface for us, which was the frame buffer to Unibus interface, which was called the F-Bunny, and then we just called it the Bunny. So when we had other people build frame buffers for us, one of the things we always asked for was for the Bunny.
Did you guys ever get a vector display? We actually, when we started, we actually bought we couldn't afford the ENS, so we ended up buying an IMI vector display, which is, to do animation, you need real-time performance. And that didn't really go anywhere for us. Did you guys have vector display at Pixar?
Well, starting at New York Tech, we had the Tektronix, where it would draw and then it flashed the screen. So that was our first line drawing. And then we got Evans and Sutherland at New York Tech. When we went to Lucasfilm, we bought a couple of the calligraphic displays, which is what Evans and Sutherland called them. But while we were at New York Tech, we designed, and one of the principal designers is Rodney Stock, we designed a frame buffer that could handle motion picture films. So it was to be 2K by 4K with 12 bits per pixel, and it was red, green, blue, and alpha. And the alpha, the transparency channel, was actually something that Alvy and I came with back in New York Tech. Actually, we had 4 frame buffers at New York Tech, and then we tied them together in order to get the alpha channel for transparency.
What were some of the big...
Go ahead.
No, in the early days of Pixar, what were some of the major hurdles you guys faced? I mean, not even Pixar, Lucas, right? You guys got into the film industry from outside that industry. Film is very traditional. I still remember going and looking at all the film printer they have. It's quite an art with some amazing engineering. But now suddenly you came in with digital as a tool set. What were some of the hurdles you had to overcome?
Well, since we were now in the film industry, we had to match what film was. And we did a lot of studies on what the resolution needed to be. We just sat in theaters where we and looked at the various patterns. And what we found in general was the limiting factor was the eye.
Right.
Anyway, so we built the frame buffer, but we also built a random access video editing system. We built a digital audio processor from scratch. But the frame buffer we built, we called the Pixar Image Computer. And around that time, George's economic situation changed, which is the reason he decided to sell us, not because he lost interest in it, just his economics became very different. But the one thing I should say is that at this time, in the entire film industry, the only person willing to fund this was George Lucas. And it wasn't that the other studios weren't willing to fund it. It's that what we were doing was utterly and completely irrelevant and off the radar. Because they couldn't even conceive of it. So George made the connection between technology, and because he did that, he then decided to form this group, and that's when I was hired. But that frame buffer then became the basis of our product to form Pixar. And at that time, we came up with volumetric imagery. We did the first 3D volume rendering of the Fat Man. That's how we got introduced to this. He's one of the professors of radiology. He's still a good friend, Elliot Fishman. So when we formed as a company, we were selling into the medical industry. We sold to Disney, and we sold to the three-letter agencies around Washington, D.C. Actually, there's one story I should say about Disney. So we wanted to have this contract to do the painting of cells at Disney. And the concepts had actually been worked out at New York Tech. And since we had that background, we wanted this contract. So Roy came and visited us, gave him a tour. Roy wanted to bring technology into Disney because he knew that his uncle Walt used all the new technology that came along. He wanted to reinvigorate animation. So he visited us up at Lucasfilm and Pixar, and we had the tour. Then we had to go to lunch. Roy was a chain smoker, and we're walking across the parking lot to go to my car, and he's smoking a cigarette, and nobody ever smokes in my car. And so as we're walking towards it, and he's smoking, I have no idea what he's talking about. I'm just thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? We got out of the car and put it on the ground and put it out. So. And we got
well, me and you have a lot of Hollywood stories to tell. So
yeah.
But going back, I mean, you guys put the first digital character in a film, live action film, right? In Young Sherlock Holmes, you had a digital character in a live action film. And how did Hollywood reacted to that?
Well, the first thing is that the people at ILM, well, they were the absolute masters, preeminent masters in the optical and chemical processes. They also were open-minded, and so they had no problem at all with us making elements for it. And in fact, we did one thing before that, which was for the Star Trek.
Right.
So we did that.
Wrath of Khan.
Yeah, the Wrath of Khan. And Albie's the one who set up this notion of flying by the planet. And the fractals on the surface came from Lauren Carpenter. And then all the detail there is that Bill Reeves was part of that. That's an amazing group of people to have this 1 minute long sequence, which was, clips of that were used in the next 2 Star Trek films. So it was used in 3 Star Trek films. And then they came to us and asked about doing this stained glass man piece in Young Sherlock Holmes. So now he's actually in the world interacting with a live action character. So that's the first, as you correctly point out, the first time the computer animated character interacts with a live person. Yeah.
Because that was quite, in the 80s, I think that was a real uphill challenge for all of us, right? I mean, we didn't have the expertise that you guys have. You have all the luminaries in the computer graphics fields. I still remember when we first started, we booted up our PD1144, we loaded Unix on it, and we realized there's zero software for doing computer graphics, right? So we basically started with a clean slate. And, we had to write all the tools ourselves, but also convince people that you can use computer graphics. And I worked with Glenn, wrote the animation software. I wrote the renderer. I wrote the compositing system, all within the first year of PDI, because we just needed it, right? And then once we started and convinced people we can do computer graphics, at that point, we didn't really have the resource to do more complex stuff than television graphics, right? So with the first few years of PDI, we were mainly focused on TV graphics, and we got to dominate that field because we did show people we can do things that nobody can do. We can animate at 60 frame feel per second, right? Really smooth, beautiful animation. And so we actually got some traction and self-funded our startup through applying computer graphics in a sector that can afford it and was practical, right? We didn't try to do character because we just couldn't afford it at that point. But one of the big hurdle was convincing people that you can actually use character, right? We had to convince, for example, Pillsbury that we can do a CG Pillsbury Doughboy, right? And we had to convince filmmaker that we can actually digitize a film and put it back up on the screen that they would accept. I still remember sitting through days and days of testing in theater to convince people in Hollywood that it's okay to digitize a film and put it back out. And those were quite a period of where we go to work every day knowing we don't know what we're doing, but we have to do it. And I think that's what a lot of us remember, is that Wild West feeling, but the fact that we were surrounded by very passionate people to get that done. And
One
you
of the
guys
things I
have a team.
remember, we had the connection with PDI. So every year at SIGGRAPH for
Yep,
several
I'm
years,
wearing the shirt.
Pixar and PDI put on a
PDI
party.
Pixar.
This is a PDI Pixar party, and we had a beach ball with that semblant of the two, and it was the most popular party at SIGGRAPH for several years. In fact, what finally did it in was that so many people came that it just kind of fell apart.
Oh, then the big stereo came in too. So. But now going back in terms of the challenge, I mean, we keep hitting walls, right? The computer was never big enough, never fast enough. Storage was never adequate. Software were never good enough. How did you motivate your team to keep pushing forward to solve all these problems? You know, especially during the 80s, there were so many hurdles of things that are so much only in people's imagination.
Well, we were far enough away, and we recognized that even as we formed Pixar, we recognized that there wasn't actually a business for animation, but the people there all wanted to do it. And Steve acquired us, and Steve acquired Pixar because of the graphics capability in the group, because he said, well, this is the best graphics group around. Now, later he rewrote the story to say that he had the vision of doing animated films and he bought into it. But the reality for the first few years, this was our passion, and our head of marketing said to Steve, and George Lucas said to Steve, you know, these guys are hell-bent on making an animated film.
Yeah.
And we finally, well, first of all, we failed as a hardware company for the reason we talked about, was that we couldn't keep up with this multi-billion-dollar industry of making faster and faster chips. And then we started to make commercials, and the first commercials were very successful. They were character-based. We listened very carefully, and we were still intent on doing animated films, and this was our start. Plus, we had a connection with Disney, which we protected. This is for doing the cell painting, which is a combination of 3 people at Pixar and then a group at Disney. And the first sequence that ever appeared in an animated film was one scene from Little Mermaid, the ending scene. And then the next film that came out was Rescuers Down Under. So this is something that most people don't know, but the first film where every frame went through the computer, or was made on the computer, was Rescuers Down Under. And they learned a lot from it. So Disney's next film was Beauty and the Beast, which is the second film that was all done with the computers. But we still had the goal of doing the feature film, but we maintained the connection with Disney even as our hardware business collapsed. So we sold the business, but we entered into a contract to move everything that was written for graphics off of our machinery onto the new silicon graphics machines that were coming out. And so by the time that the company that bought the picture image computer failed, then it didn't matter because we had everything running on silicon graphics. And silicon graphics, because of its the power that it had at the time changed the game. And it changed it for us, certainly, because we started to move over into making commercials.
Right. And it's interesting. The first probably 6-7 years of Silicon Graphics, we couldn't really afford them because they were too expensive for us in our business model. So we had to get by with what we had. I actually wrote a real-time lighting tool back in end of 83 that we used for many years. And so we sort of had a lot of cheats to work around our limitation, not having these fancy hardware. And the key was trying to figure out how to survive. I mean, in fact, it's sort of an interesting story. When Tron came out, they sort of connected the dots between computer graphics and for a lot of technology people, right? Tron was this groundbreaking work. And all the studio that worked on Tron didn't survive, right? And after that, we had to take things step at a time, right? We couldn't jump right and do animated film, even though we did a lot of animated shorts that we submitted over the years and some really nice work. But we couldn't afford to do the character work that we want to set out to do, right? Because when we started PDI, I always say, we can use computer to tell stories. Not necessarily just in animation, but many different ways. But it took us a long time before we can get to a point where it became practical for us to do that. I mean, that's when we get to the late 80s. I wrote my first facial animation system in like the late 80s. And, people would just go, okay, now we can see that we can make this cost effective enough. Then we can move forward to make this a business out of it. But we were watching some amazing stuff coming out of Pixar is really the driving force for us to keep reinventing the wheel so we can make it affordable. And it was quite a challenge that time, I can tell you. It was not easy.
Well, having too much money, I think, screws people up. Not having enough, you just have to work harder to come up with better algorithms.
Right.
And since we were going for feature films and we knew it wasn't economically possible, we said, well, economics are part of it. Unless you get the economics right, it's not going to work.
During those late 80s, right, it started to branch off a lot into live action and other areas. You guys were still very focused on just animation. And we were doing a lot more live action work and trying to, because we had to survive, and, did a lot of graphics work too, even to the late 80s. I actually got to design a opening for Monday Night Football, which is on my resume, which is sort of fun. But nevertheless, you do what you can to survive, right? And we had tough times where we got down to just a few weeks of payroll and not survive, but we pulled through, and luckily enough, we survived through all these years. But one of the things we found was challenging is people want to pull us in so many different directions, right? I started to do computer graphics and visual effects. And we had a team doing a lot of innovative work. We had a team that did Michael Jackson, all the morphing in some of his earlier video. That got a lot of attention. But then we started doing digital effects in film. And we ran into a lot of challenges where people want things to look real. And computer graphics were not ready for that at that point. There was some very good paper published during the late 80s and early 90s that pointed in that direction. But I can tell you that the demand was really driving it, but we were struggling to meet that demand, right? I think even today, the realistic part is still, we're much closer, but it's an ongoing challenge. Did you guys face challenge, and what were the big challenge in making animated film for you guys? Like the tools, the creative?
One thing to note was that I always believed that the effects business was a low margin business. And
no kidding.
There was no, Well, I just said, we actually can't succeed at that as a business. So we had to hold on to other things if we're ever going to get to the feature film. Because the feature film, you can actually get enough if you make a very good film. Now, there was a whole period of time in the 80s and early 90s when trying to achieve realism was a driving force. And it wasn't because, from our point of view, that realism was the end goal,
Right.
but it was picking a really hard goal. And as we started off, like we were so far away from it that there was just a lot of focus on what it meant to have lighting and complexity, and we kept pushing on that until you got to the point where things actually did look realistic. I remember the first feature film where there were places where I couldn't tell was that first, The Good Batman, not the original series, but when they had the good one, and there were some effects in there, and I didn't know which was which, and I thought, wow, it's for the first time, it's realistic.
Yeah.
But that was the driving force. But at Pixar, while we were doing it, because we were selling software into the special effects business, and they were driven by realistic looking images. For us, we still wanted to be abstract. Right. And the first film we got was in 90. In 90, Disney started to negotiate with us to do a film. And the reality is that when John Lasseter left Disney, he'd been fired, and he was kind of still pissed at him. So we thought we'd reached the point where we could make a 22-minute television or half-hour program, because we've been making commercials. And the reason we wanted to make commercials was we knew that we needed to be able to have the discipline of delivering to people, some of whom would be very hard on us. That would be a good discipline to go through. So the next thing was to do a 22-minute film. And we started to shop it around to all the studios, with the exception of Disney, even though we'd worked very hard to keep a good relationship with Disney. Yeah. And then it was Peter Schneider who called me into his office, and he said, we'd like to talk to you about doing a feature film. Now, they had successfully made Nightmare Before Christmas, which is stop motion, in San Francisco. And they looked at that as a boutique film, and in some sense it was, right? It had a strong niche following. And they were convinced that computer graphics was also a boutique project. And they used the word, it's boutique. Now, for us, it's okay, our next step is to make a 22-minute special, then do a feature film, because we weren't quite ready yet. And I said to Peter, we're planning to do a 22-minute special first. And Peter said, if you can do 22 minutes, you can do 75. And I thought about it for about 1 nanosecond and said, oh, you're right. So that's when we started the negotiation. And Steve Jobs then negotiated with Jeffrey Katzenberg.
Okay.
And
we'll leave that at that.
Pardon?
We'll leave it at that.
Well, no, but here's the funny thing about it, was that both of them walked away feeling like they'd left something on the table and they'd been screwed by the other. So at their next negotiation, after we did Toy Story, then Steve negotiated with Eisner, and he was going to make sure that he didn't leave anything on the table. So the logic he gave to us was we have to go public because we're going to say we have to have a 50-50 partnership. But in the meantime, after we were successful, Katzenberg came to PDI, and he didn't want to be taken advantage of, so he negotiated with PDI. And so they both had this mindset of coming out of this battle with each other. And it was very interesting to see the outcomes from that.
Okay. Now, in doing that, I mean, in the early 90s, we were both faced with the challenge of scaling computer graphics up to a larger scale, right? In the early 90s, we did our first long format. We did a Halloween special for Mars Candy, where we did 92 shots. And I sat down I still remember in the early 90 to be precise, and wrote the whole pipeline in like a month. Just sat down by myself, wrote the pipeline. So I built the pipeline tool based on the fact that we now have to do a long format show. A lot of process changes, right? How you manage data, large data set, larger team. before then, we never really dealt with big problems like that, right? So and in 92, 93, I did the digital Batman for some of the not so great Batman film. I did the first all digital stunt person in a live action film. And that started to set in that direction where people realize you can now put digital human in a film in situation and eventually be able to do more and more of that. And so a lot of the challenge was scaling, right? Scaling the rendering farm, scaling the team, scaling, training enough people to do these large format work, right? When you guys were working on the beginning of A Toy Story, we were doing things like 3D Homer Simpson, various things like that. So we had the same scaling problem. So how we both had to compete and hire people to build up our studio to raise that capacity. The technology was technology, computing technology was a barrier for you?
Well, it was. I mean, for you, it's the combination of things. We're in the world in which the cost of computers was still high, and you need a lot of them in order to do the rendering. And the tools were all fairly primitive, both in terms of the modeling and the animation. And we were all using our short projects to develop those underlying tools. But the short projects, to your point, were not built for large scale.
Right.
So as soon as you say, okay, we're going to go from doing a small project, a commercial, and in Pixar's case, every year we did a short film. So the short films were 5 to 7 minutes long.
Right.
So our scaling consisted of getting up to 5 to 7 minutes. And our very first one was actually done at Lucasfilm with Andre and Wallaby, and then there was the Luxo lamp one. And we were using each one to advance the technology very explicitly. Like, let's break some new grounds. So that got us to 5 to 7 minutes. And then we calculate, okay, we can get to the 22 minutes. But once we committed to the full feature film, then it was building the thing from scratch, as well as for you. It's like there's a lot of hand-holding. People were doing things manually because the pipeline wasn't in place. We didn't know enough. Neither of us knew enough to really build a pipeline to work at that length. And we had to do it from scratch, figuring it out, and recognizing that the old systems weren't just something where you gave more stuff to it. You had to rewrite it. Which is right. What you did, like you rewrote your pipeline.
Yeah. I mean, there's a funny story there. I wrote the pipeline to allow us to check in, check out files. And one day, this was doing the TV series, I get a call and they say, oh, things are breaking down because one of the production assistant didn't know the file system were mounted. And she started deleting all the files thinking that they were not supposed to be on her computer. And it shut down the whole production. But luckily I had a check-in, check-out system, sort of a versioning system. So I restored everything in 30 minutes. But you learn very quickly when you're in production, you have deadlines. I think one thing nice about the film industry that drove us, at least in the commercial and film industry, is we had the real deadlines. We couldn't miss those, right? And so you learn to be resourceful to meet those deadlines. But I can tell you, in the 90s, it was really a period where we were stepping into a real unknown. I still remember when we started doing Ants. One day, one of the producers came into my office and said, Richard, we have no idea what we're doing. We're freaked out. Everybody's freaked out. So I called everybody into a room and basically said, look, we've never done this before. I never done this before. But look, here's everybody. Here's the story department. Here's the director. Here's the modeling people. We stepped through and pointed to everybody in the room by name and said, look, between all of us, there's nothing we can't do. It's just recognize that. And it was quite a bit of learning. I think the people that went through that early stage of facing that challenge came out of it much more educated in terms of how they move forward.
Well, there's an irony in that with those first ones, as you point out, there was no cavalry coming in. There wasn't anybody else. It's like, we're it. So you've got people, none of whom have done it before, have to figure it out on their own. It was the same thing we had with Toy Story. Like, nobody had ever done this. We had to figure it out on the fly.
Yeah.
And what I find ironical about that is today, as we make feature films, people and managers are afraid to take a risk on new people because they haven't had any experience. But the first films we did, nobody had any experience, and it worked out fine. So this worry about having the experience is an illusion. Is it given the chance? I think most people can rise to the occasion. And they'll figure it out. There's no cavalry coming. You got to figure it out.
Well, but I think both of us had the fortunate history of having built a very strong team that helped lay the bricks and the foundation to get us there, right? I think for a lot of newer studios who didn't have that history, it's a much challenging problem. I mean, the film industry, taught us a lot about how to be accountable, but as well as how to be ready for surprises, right? Nothing give us more surprise than management in Hollywood, right? Maybe your experience better than mine, but I can tell you, working in Hollywood all these years is a little bit different than the tech industry, right? Like in the tech industry, you can drift your deadline a little bit, you can cut a few shortcuts, but when you're facing a director or a studio head with a delivery date, very few compromise from their perspective, right?
Yeah, well, like in the film world, as it was with commercials too. In the film world, they've built this major campaign around advertising and so forth. And so you come in and say, "Oh, we need to slip 3 months." Oh, no, that doesn't work. And you only have a couple windows in which you can even present a film.
Right, and me and you know where all the money goes in making film, and a lot of it goes into the promotion and advertising, probably oftentimes more than the production side. So, and now in terms of getting into the 90s, right, because of our time limitation, and then we now hit 2000, right? Through the 90s, we built our first film, right? Then we get into our second film. Then we start overlapping film production. Right. In the mid 90s, I had this great system guy, Mike Chang, who switches all of us over to using PC. Right. We're no longer an expensive workstation. We start buying commodity hardware, running Linux, and we moved our whole platform over that. So it made it much more cost effective to make film. And then now suddenly people set much higher expectations for what we can do. Right. Our first film had no hair. All the characters were very simple, Toy Story, Bugs Life, ants. The next thing you know, we want characters with long flowing hair. We want all these complex scenes. And the creative demand was astonishing. And so we had to continue to innovate. And you guys seem to have faced that very well during that time. A lot of innovation in terms of rendering technology, and managing all the data and all that. And how do you keep that momentum going?
Well, the first thing was with Toy Story is the technical people. As we watched the reviews coming in for Toy Story, there was usually typically only 1 or 2 lines, which is about the technology, and the rest of it is about the movie. Yeah. And the technical people all took pride in that, because it wasn't about demonstrating technology, it was about making a real movie.
Right.
The other thing that we paid attention to, and a lot of attention right from the beginning, was to try to keep a class structure out. Because I'd looked at other companies, and the technical people were first class, and the others were second class, or like at Disney at that time, the artists were first class, and the technical people were second class. And it's easy for it to creep into any organization. But we worked really hard to make sure that they were all peers with each other. So they were teammates. And you saw this cross-driving of where the artists really wanted to do hair. And we all knew the first film was limited. The characters were made out of plastic. That's why they were toys.
Yeah. Well, I think...
And then...
Go ahead.
I was going to say, with Bugs Life, we wanted uneven terrain. And you had to have translucency in the grass and in the leaves. So each one of them, we wanted to have a challenge, but we knew there was a limit to what we could do. So just keep pushing, figure out which ones we could do, and do that film after film after film.
Well, I think one thing both of us really agreed on over the years is the overlap between creativity and technology, right? I was notorious for dragging my programmer and throwing them into production, saying that if you're going to build tools that you're going to use yourself. And, you know, we both probably have a lot of horror story about big technology project that didn't turn out well. But at the end, trying to get people to cross those barriers, bridging the gap between the creative and the technology side, it has really worked out well for us and for you as well.
Well, there are, in a film production, there are some departments where they're supposed to design something or build something and so forth. Then there are other departments that are shot-based. So the animation you have to produce on a certain amount per week, or with lighting, it's shot-based. And the mindset of being in a shot-based department where there's a daily or a weekly schedule is very different than the others. So if you have the technical people actually rotate into a shot department,
right,
then they see they're facing a different kind of problem and a different kind of schedule problem than they do on their own projects. And you can't explain it. You just have to do it. And once you do it, you see, oh, that's what their problem is that they couldn't explain. Now I get it. And so you go back and you write tools to help the people that have got shot-based problems.
Yeah. Okay. We have limited time. I just want to move forward because I don't want to. Me and you can probably talk about this for all day today. We have time, but let's move into the 2000. Right. We all now have gotten one or two films under our belt. The computer graphic industry. Me and you still attended SIGGRAPH regularly. SIGGRAPH is the organization for all the people at ACM who are familiar with that focus on the field of computer graphics. And we were seeing a lot of innovation and new ideas come on board in the late 90s and early 2000s, right? Things like light field and laser scanning, all that cool stuff started to happen. And then the industry started to broaden, right? The effects field started to broaden quite a bit, right? And then you get things like, you know, Lord of the Rings and movies like that coming out. But you stay very focused in the animation side. What's your perspective of what's happening around you during that time as you see everything sort of rises?
Yeah, our view at the time still was that the effects business was low margin. And
it's still low margin.
It's still low margin. And will be always low margin. And our view throughout the entire thing, we actually formed a games group once.
Yes.
And we realized, oh, actually, we're not really gamers, so it's the wrong thing for us to do. We had a CD-ROM business, and we actually did better with our two films than our two CD-ROMs than anybody else.
Yeah.
But we only made a little bit of money. So it's like being king of the hill, and the hill's 2 feet tall. So, okay,
the gaming people.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that what we realized is if we did everything from beginning to end, then we could succeed commercially better because we're doing art, but at the same time, you can't keep going and advancing unless you get people who appreciate the art and are willing to pay to see it. So it was a combination of the two. So we stayed away from the other areas because we didn't think they gave us enough leeway to keep pushing on the state of the art.
Right. It's interesting that in the world of computer graphics, gaming people actually had a head start on us in some way, right? The Atari and all that. But we were in a very different world, right? I had frame rendering on Shrek that were 24 hours of frame, right? And they're dealing with things in real time. But it's interesting that through the last 20 years, they all start to now converge together, and we've seen a lot of innovation there. So, okay, let's quickly go into the 2000 period, right? In 2000, we closed our not too profitable service business in visual effects. DreamWorks had us mainly focused on animation. So we stopped doing commercial and visual effects work in 2002. So, you know, it's a long run, but as you said, the margin was low enough, even though we made money in our last year, It's just nothing. It's like 1/10 the margin of making animated film. So what I end up doing, is recognizing that the world becoming much more global because of the onset of internet during the late 90s. And it's through SIGGRAPH, I was noticing the talent and work popping up all around the world. So I went on a different path in the 2000s and start to look at setting up production globally at DreamWorks. I was involved with setting up a first television production in Hong Kong. And then we end up setting up a studio in India. And through that process, it was very interesting to see how the world have now picked up, due to the internet, knowledge and know-how and motivation to jump into computer graphics. So the audience and the number of practitioners jumped exponentially during the early 2000s. And that's what I dealt with. But so that I saw it from a little bit different perspective. You were focused on growing Disney business at that point and into the film and expanding the animation space. How did you view how the world were picking up on computer graphics? Were the technology moving fast enough for you to meet the expectation?
Well, to me, one of the most phenomenal things that took place over this period of time was when Silicon Graphics melted down. Engineers started a number of companies, and one of the companies, and I pick out NVIDIA because I think they did the best job of it, with Jensen Huang running it. And I think he was and is a brilliant leader. But they started this virtuous cycle. And the cycle was that the engineers would go to SIGGRAPH and they hear the latest algorithms. They go back to NVIDIA or the ATI. They're making these chips. So they go back to NVIDIA. They build the chips. But the entertainment and the academic industry was really small. Like they just couldn't buy enough machines to justify this chips. But they'd make these faster chips, which were sold into the game industry, which is this multi-billion-dollar industry. But the chips would then go into boards that would go into entertainment and academia. So we now had more processing power. We'd write some new algorithms and publish them at SIGGRAPH. And then NVIDIA would go and they'd put them in the chips. So you would go from SIGGRAPH to building chips, to buying them for gaming, to faster processing speed for academia and entertainment, for more papers. So spiraling up and up to the point where some people, like Pat Hanrahan being one of them, recognize that there is so much compute power in these machines that we can use them for something else. Now, deep learning and neural networks was an idea that had been around a long time, but it came to a dead halt because they didn't have enough compute power. Well, all of a sudden there was enough compute power, as well as with the internet there was a lot of data. There's enough compute power to begin to restart this industry. So here we have computer graphics and gaming interacting with each other, spawning and enabling deep learning, which is affecting the entire industry. And most people don't make the connection to realize that this monumental change that's taken place now got its roots in computer graphics.
Right. I was talking to Kirk Akeley, who's one of the original team on Silicon Graphics. And he said the big step they made that made things possible is making the graphics hardware not customized, made it customizable through software, right? They now allow people to use it for more than just one thing, right? And that made a huge difference. You know, the original OpenGL, that whole idea of having programmable shader is what led to the usage of that technology across the board. I mean, obviously our time's very limited here, but now, yeah, actually that's an interesting thing because going into the 2000, you know, the world have started to broaden. I left DreamWorks in 2008 and did a startup on distributed stuff, but I won't get into it here. But then in the early 2010, the 10s, right, I got involved with the mindset that I think I want to look at the other extreme, looking at the onset of the internet. I'm, coming from the film business where we made our movies, as you know, are over $1 million per minute, right? And I sat down and did some calculation after I left DreamWorks, and because one of my last job at DreamWorks was actually writing a management tool that managed our production. And then I looked at the financial part and realized for the internet, we need to hit like $1,000 per minute to be competitive in the mobile internet space, right? Which is 3 orders of magnitude different than the feature film. So I went down that journey in the 2010s to trying to figure out how to solve that problem, right? I was running a studio in Asia, in Taiwan, that did the animated news, right? And they were doing production that had a complete turnaround of 2 hours from the time when a news story broke to when they can put it on air is 2 hour. This is high def CG animated stuff on air. The quality wasn't super, but they had the mindset that they can take an idea and turn it into production in 2 hour period. So that's when I went out there and trying to figure out how to solve this problem from a very different perspective. Right? I put on a new hat. I'm wearing my internet hat, a web-based hat, and I'm going, okay, if we can do production for under $1,000 per minute, there's a model that makes sense from a financial standpoint. Right? If I take the $1 million per minute, that just doesn't add up. Because the turnaround time, right? As you know, the film turnaround time is very long. To address the internet crowd, so my goal at that point, and we actually did a test where we were streaming real-time CG from Taiwan to Japan using actually Unreal Engine back in 2013, and proved that we can get production costs down to that low. But turns out the technology was feasible, but creatively we were not ready, right? Couldn't get quite the creative people backing it properly to move forward in that space. So I spent a lot of time looking at alternate way of creating content, right? This is not the high-end content at that price range, but allow you to do a whole bunch of stuff that you do now with the real-time feedback loop of your audience that you can not do in a theater. So I went off and did something completely different. So that's been my experience in the last 10 years in terms of how computer graphics can take on a different form. And where do you see...
We talked before about scaling, and the one thing is that while scaling occupied us for a number of years, scaling the storytelling is far harder.
Yeah, definitely that is far from. Actually, the other thing too, one thing that still bugs me, as we close to our end time, is that most of the software we use in creating content in the computer graphics space are very rooted in very ancient history. So if anything, my biggest complaint is no new innovation in the tools people use so we can empower a bigger audience, a larger generation of content creators, right? The learning curve on using something like Maya or something like that is still very steep, right? I'm sure even when you left the Pixar toolset, it's not like you can walk up and start animating, right? So how can the world change to improve and motivate people to build a new set of tools so that more people can get involved?
Well, the streaming is going to force the issue, and I don't know exactly where it's going other than the fact that it's forcing the issue.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine who works at Netflix, and they got over 1,000 production going on, right? And the computing technology is not just the tool making the pixel, but the whole infrastructure, right? I think we finally have built a business where we do end-to-ends all digital, from the idea to the creation to the delivery to the consumption is all done on the computer. And so now you have an ecosystem where it's totally based on the computing platform in every respect, right? All the way from the initial storyboarding to the person sitting at home watching on the digital TV with the high dynamic range 4K content. And a lot of that is still sitting with very old thinking. I think this field really needs some new breakthrough to empower a new generation of thinking, right? I think machine learning is a good example, right? I'm a real believer that machine learning will make great tools, but it's not an end-all, right? It's not the creative replacement for ideas or innovation, and not in any time soon. So, you guys start to use a lot of AI stuff? I mean, we first used AI, like Sean Neely used neural network for doing color correction, 26 years ago, maybe. And then we had a lot of exposure to it back then, and now we're seeing everybody's talking about it. What's your perspective on it?
Well, the first use, interestingly enough, was an idea that came out of Disney, which is for denoising. And then we did some neural networks for denoising Pixar films. And then the Zurich lab from Disney Research actually made it to the point where it could go into a renderer. So it's these three groups working together. I would never have guessed when I started with neural networks that the first use of Pixar would be for denoising. But it's going to have an effect. And again, it's the economics and allowing people to do something which is unexpected. Right. Is going to mean that somebody has to come in and do something that is quite different. And with any group, once you're successful, there's a conservatism that sets in. But I'd have to say in the effects business, one of the things about the low margin is they had to be more creative about what they were doing. So what we found was that the big changes would come out of the animation houses, but the rapid iteration came out of the effects houses.
Yeah.
So we had both rapid iteration and big iteration going on simultaneously, which had this really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I think that looking forward, that's actually an interesting concern of mine. Obviously, in the visual effects low margin business, machine learning actually works really well, right? They're not engineers in the sense they don't have the bridge that had to survive an earthquake. When you make a film, as long as it looks good enough, it's good enough. So the usage of machine learning in terms of visual effects has been very successful. In terms of, like, you don't have to perfectly simulate a fire, it just has to look like a fire, right? You don't have to perfectly simulate an explosion, it has to look like an explosion. So it has been working very well in that space. And one of my concerns, I think, I don't know if is happening yet, is what happened is when you have a tool set that can now learn from the expert and duplicate their work. So one of the most important part, as I observe in studios, and you probably observe the same, is this learning from the master, working as an apprentice under somebody who's done the work, and you home in on your skill, not only on the technology, but in the creative aspect. But when that internship or that apprenticeship go away, because now instead of having a bunch of young kids replicating the work of a lead animator, you just have a computer following the lead animator. You're now losing that time where people can learn the process and hone in the creative skill. My big concern is somewhere down the line when this current generation of lead retire, there will be a gap in the creative space because you didn't have the room for the young people to learn along the way to develop the creative skill. So that's my 2 cents worth on machine learning going forward.
I'm optimistic. I think that because I can't foretell the future, I think they'll figure something out.
Yeah. And now for me, the big revolution, we start jumping very quickly to today and going forward. In this last year is in Disney live action side, they made Mandalorian with a LED panel screen, right? Where they can shoot a film now where all the effects are done in real time on Unreal Engine. So the background's completely done in real time. So there's no post-production. You shoot what you get. And it cut the cost of production substantially down. So for me, that's like one of these inflection moments where you can see how at least in live action filmmaking, you now have made a radical switch in that space where you can now make film using a technology coming from sort of a collection of ideas from the all across the board in computer graphics, right? Image processing to tracking the camera, machine learning to improve the distortion so it matches what the camera is seeing. And the Unreal Engine from the gaming space is now finally converging to provide solution that's actually very usable and very practical. And do you see that happening?
If you think about it, there are a lot of really good live action series. So there are writer rooms where they can figure out a sequence. And so you take that and say, okay, can we get the economics and get it up on the screen? We already know they can do long format that way. So we get the economics with things like that, and we can make animated series, I think, in an economical way. And so the current crisis is one of those things that opens a lot of elements in the world because it's forcing it. Because people recognize there's a moment in time we have to change the way we work, and we will. And I hope it actually extends way beyond animation into the way we think about the earth, the water, the temperature, and all those elements, that this is a moment in time to say, okay, let's rethink a lot of things. And that, you know, for all the tragedy that's there, that whenever you have that, you should step back and pause. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? What are our reasons? What are our ethics? What's important to us?
Yeah, I think throughout both of our history, we often face in business or our experience things that we don't know how to do, or business is bad, and we recognize, we see the abyss, but we always rise up and reinvent it. And I think that's the great thing about being in this field is you're surrounded by people who understand that even though a lot of things you don't know how to do, but you have the resource and know-how to overcome it. And I think this time in history is a time that I think we all can learn, everybody can learn from that experience.
And fundamentally, I think this is where the creativity comes in. It isn't about the art, it's about all of it. It's responding to the problems that we see local, around the world, in our communities, and basically pulling in something new and trying to respond to whatever that problem is.
Yeah, and not take things for granted. I think I always told my team, I said, look, you come in every day, even you doing something you've done before, always look at how you can do it better, right? And that's how we can continue to keep marching forward. I think in today's world, everybody needs to do that. Our government, our educator, I can spend hours talking about how we can improve education. I'm sure you can too. And it is a time in space where we all have to self-reflect and support each other and encourage people to be positive, and also giving the support to people that need support and move forward from there. So
the other thing to note is while you and I have been talking about it, and we referred to a few people, in fact, there are a lot of people who are not known that were all part of this. And personally, I feel this real gratitude to have worked with so many great people, because it could not have been done without them. And I know that's the thing that a lot of people say, but it really is true that it took this amazing group of people to make things happen. And there's no way to tell the whole story. But I feel very strong gratitude for the people that support it, but also the people that solved the problems, the people that stepped up when it was needed.
Well, I think me and you have very similar perspective on that, right? For us, running a project, running a team, is not about me. It's about how I can make my team successful, right? We put in the time, and you're very patient and very good at supporting your team. And it's really about helping each other be successful. I think that's what created two studios that had a very successful history. And in fact, my most gratifying part of PDI long after I left is hearing from people to say, hey, what do you remember from PDI? And they said, nothing I miss more than the the people we had and how we support each other, right? Nothing about the graphics, nothing about the technology. It's really about how we help build the environment that allow each of us to take risk and succeed. So.
And with that, I see it's 10:30.
Yes, our time is up. And nobody's hounding us.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to stop you. Sorry. I figure it was really interesting for everyone involved to kind of hear the perspective, your two perspectives. So yeah, thank you so much for that. We're gonna, if you're okay, Ed and Richard, we're gonna go move forward with question and answers, and we're gonna extend the time a little bit just to be able to do that. Would you be okay with that?
Certainly.
Sure.
Great. Yeah.
We're not going anywhere.
I think, yeah, that's the joke I've been using.
Let me out of the house. We're in the house arrest here.
Oh no, my mom is like texting me all night. Is like, "Are you going out of the house?" Don't. But yeah, let's get to some Q&A. So you're both relatively retired. I don't remember, Richard, if you're retired yet. But kind of, what does that retirement look like for a pioneer, like for you two?
Well, I've never been so busy in my life. I think the term
Same
is
here.
over-retired. It's like, I miss the days in which there was some structure and you could actually take time to breathe. Now there's way too much going on. This retirement stuff is an illusion. Sitting back, reading a book. Oh, I wish.
I'm still programming, so there you go.
Yeah, that's pretty great. Yeah. And this is sort of a question for Ed, but I think, Richard, if you have thoughts on it, please feel free to chime in too. Ed, since you largely spent your career in industry, in retrospect, do you think you should have skipped getting a PhD, or is it something that's relevant in the field, in the particular field right now?
Well, personally, I think there's something that you gain personally by getting a PhD. It isn't so much the knowledge, but the fact that you push through and you have to do it. It was one of the most valuable experiences in my life. I think when people do this, that it's important for them. It's not that everybody needs it, though. Some people, they develop a certain set of skills, they're ready to lose it, and they'll skip that process. That's true. You don't have. There is no one way to do it. But I would never even. It would never have occurred to me not to have gone through that process because I gained so much from it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess if there's anything you could do now, like if you're like still at the University of Utah starting your master's, would you do anything differently, or would there be any graphic topics that you would want to study and investigate today?
Oh, well, since I've already done this path, if I were going to do another path, I would probably look at certain elements of machine learning. I still think they're at the early days. I think the notion of internal and external models is not very well developed at the moment. I think that quantum computing looks really interesting. And there's I still have this love of physics. I mean, physics is kind of stuck in certain areas there. Could I bring something? I don't know. It took a lot of years to do something in graphics. Physics is even harder. But I could imagine 3 areas now that I would go into. I wouldn't want to repeat what I've done because I've already done it. Unfortunately, I don't have another 50 years, though. This particular arc it's 49 years since I took that class from Ivan Sutherland until I retired. And so the next 49 years will be interesting, but the question is, will I be around for it?
Yeah. It's been 40 years since I took your class, so.
Oh, yeah. No, I can imagine. That's an interesting point, because I think like there are some hard technology problems that I think a lot of people are interested in kind of understanding and solving in the next 5 to 10 years. Beyond, I guess, machine learning and quantum computing are 2 of them. Are there anything that you foresee that could be particularly interesting?
From my perspective, go ahead.
I was going to say, I mean, there are the important areas of energy and waste environmental concern, use of land. Each one of them has got a component of how do you take care of people. To me, it's one of the things that was missed along the way as we went through automation and so forth, is the people who are affected by it. Nobody's looking out for them, which caused all sorts of problems because nobody was looking out for this whole big group of people. But like the process we went through, there's a sociological and emotional part and a technical part. And I think that there's some really interesting problems in each one of those areas.
Yeah, for me, an interesting area is education, because I really feel like the education system have not kept up with where we are going. It's a struggle in many ways. I still remember, I'm on the board of schools. I remember a kid that won some contest, a machine learning contest, and I went to him. I said, "Hey, I want to thank all the professors that helped you get here." And he goes, "Sorry, I didn't learn from them. I learned on my own online because they don't teach that stuff," right? And I think we need to really rethink how we educate and how we connect people. I think in terms of the management process we have, because now we have ecosystem that can span across multiple discipline, multiple, nationality, all concurrently. And the world's not quite set up to organize and manage a large group of people, right? We have the gig economy. That's a good example, right? How we manage the gig economy is still very in the early phase. And there's a lot of changes we can make in terms of how we structure our businesses and our economy to better address this new, very dynamic business environment. So,
yeah, no, that makes sense. I think I know, Richard, when we talked, we have breakfast, and that's one of the things we talk about is graphics as a visual communication tool and what that means for the world, right? And I was just curious about your perspective on that. Where does graphics fit in the broader scope of computing?
I think graphics is this wonderful tool that lets you imagine things. My first project actually I ever did was to work with a guy named Scott Kim, who wrote this amazing book called Inversion, and we had to do visualization of 4D rotation and 4D inversion for him. And those are concepts that you can't even imagine until you see it. And that was like 40 years ago. And in today, in the world where we're dealing with so much complex things that are black boxes, which is one of my concern of the machine learning space, is the lack of understanding what's happening underneath, right? So I'm working with people, and I'm seeing that there's so much room for growth in terms of how we can use the visual sense in not just space, but time to help people explain these more complex concepts, right? What is a neural network doing? And we're just barely touching the surface of applying new technique to help people understand complex concepts. As the world becomes more complex, the more need there will be for tools to help people understand what's underneath the hood.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think, I guess the follow-up question for that would be, as a computing professional, if I was a young computing professional and I was kind of interested in expanding kind of my horizons in terms of what I could do beyond just the traditional expectations for computer graphics, where would you see the positive evolutions and opportunities would be?
Ed?
Well,
you want to take that first?
The one thing to notice, I found I learned the most when I tried to program it for the purpose of giving myself a visualization. It was actually writing the program that gave me the greatest insight. And the result of it was a picture I could show to other people, but they really, I don't think, got the insight that I could get by trying to get it to the point where I could present it to somebody else. And it's that trying to make it or trying to program it which helps us learn. That's why I think, to Richard's point, a lot of people learn on their own because it's only if you do it to yourself, it's almost from scratch, that you get things that you couldn't have gotten by listening to a lecture.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize now one of the most powerful 3D tools is your web browser. Every web browser supports WebGL. You can write shader on your web browser, and I've done several projects in the last 10 years where most of the work was just done using a web, kit or a web browser. And the availability is global. there's no more excuse for not having access to 3D, capability, because every web browser supports it. So I think people need to recognize that the access is no longer the issue. It's just really having an education curriculum that supports that, right? And empowering the masses to use what's right in front of them to learn. I think that's a key step.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think that's one of the things that ACM really strives for. I think there is a question there in the Q&A actually about kind of foreseeing what the positive evolution for education in this context would be. And Richard, I know you've been working with Cogswell, and Ed has been an educator for a very long time as well. I think where do you see a positive trend would be for educating on computer graphics?
Well, I'll go first. I have one very passionate area that probably upset a lot of people in this audience. I think the whole concept of publishing things in just a paper format should be gone. Every paper should be an interactive web page where people can try out what you're talking about, run an instance on the cloud of what you were experimenting with. Knowledge should be interactive and accessible, not this paper that you read and then you try to figure out how to do it afterward, right? And I think we need to move the whole communication of ideas to modern language of accessible, interactive, graphical environment, which nowadays is just your web page. Why can't we do that, right? And that will go a long way into bridging that gap from idea to realization, right?
Okay, so I'll challenge that, Richard.
Yeah.
The reason is there was basically a paper that was presented visually at SIGGRAPH many years ago, and it was very successful. And so the next year I was chair. It's the only time I was chair of the papers committee. And I wanted to try two new things. One is I wanted to publish the proceedings digitally. So it was the first digital presentation, and frankly, it was a real pain in the neck because everybody had different formats of what the papers were. But that started, and so from then on, there was always a digital publication. But the second thing was I wanted to have people present things with visual or with video or of some sort, something interactive. Nothing came of it. One of them was very successful and the other one failed. And I had to think about, okay, why did it fail? And the reason it failed was that watching something isn't the same as getting deep into how it works. And the reason the papers work is because they force you to go and try to understand what they did. If they showed us what they did, then I'm looking at the pictures, and actually it doesn't challenge me, and it's the same way of trying to understand it. Yeah. And it's that doing versus watching. And I love the watching part, and it's one of the reasons I do things is that. But I actually found the most challenging things was the understanding and the doing. And I think of them as two separate things. That's why I say, oh, no, actually, it's probably more appropriate for the papers to present. But the output from them is video or pictures. And when you go to SIGGRAPH, they're showing you their output, and they're showing you their pictures, and they're showing you their videos, but they're telling you how they did it. And you need both.
I think that's a very legitimate argument. But I just feel like there's a new audience, right? Because now when we publish a paper, it's not just the people with the in crowd that looks at it, but there's a whole new group of people who know nothing about what we do that can stumble across it. And somehow we need to make that entry a little bit easier. I'm not sure what's the right way. I've been dealing a lot of this machine learning paper, and I wish every paper I can just click and go on and open up a Jupyter notebook and have, an instant in the cloud where I can build it up like they did, but try out different things to understand it a little bit better, right? So the technology is there for you to give a broader experience, but I do agree that people, until they do it under the hood, right? That's the extreme case where they teach you just how to push button. Although, a lot of classes now, then when you take on machine learning are just that, right? Everything's pre-done for you. You just click yes, 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 and you accomplish something while understanding. And we have to look under the hood. I think we need to continue to teach people to look under the hood. And maybe I'm old school, but that's what you now can explore new ideas when you know how to look under the hood. So.
Well, if you take the extremes, the extreme of not looking under the hood is playing games. All right, so you're interacting with it, but you have no concept of what is under the hood.
Right.
In fact, I was
the story you told me last time.
Yeah, well, I asked two kids who basically are on the computers and they play games and so forth, and so I just asked the question because the network has gone to hell while everybody's home with streaming, and people are saying, "What's wrong with the internet?" And I said, "Well, part of it's all this streaming." And one of them said, "Well, the other is the gaming." And I said, "Well, the thing about gaming though is the images for most of these games, not all of them, but for most of these games, the image is generated locally because the person you're playing against actually normally doesn't see what you're seeing. They're seeing from their point of view. So what's being transferred back and forth?" And I said, "I haven't actually played recently, but do you know, are we actually sending images or are we just sending the data to connect them?" They didn't understand the question. So that's interesting. It wasn't that they didn't know the answer. They didn't understand what the question was. So this is the extreme of I'm a user of it, but I know nothing of what goes on under the hood. But if you know what's under the hood, you have a different experience. So the question you asked earlier, Richard, was, okay, where does the next generation come from? What do they learn? What's their mentoring? And I think their mentoring comes from saying, okay, build something. Go under the hood and build it. Show us your cool stuff. But I want your mentoring or your learning process is that writing.
Well, I actually do agree with that. I mean, when my son started playing game when he was a kid, we were so worried that I said, "Look, you want to play a game, learn to write your own game. You can play all you want." So you learn programming, and it's a big challenge, I think, for society because a lot of parents are not technical. And now the new generation is faced with a lot of technology that can change people's belief and change people's understanding of the world for good or for bad. And having the understanding of what's under the hood is give them the ability to be a critical thinker, right? And I think that's a good point there.
Yeah, well, I mean, no, those are really good points. Oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
That's how you learned, Richard. It's like you built massive systems.
Yeah.
A lot of you built yourself, but you really understand them at a deep level.
Actually, my question is actually to follow up on kind of the conversation on education, mostly because that's kind of like something that I've been thinking about myself, and a lot of people in the Q&A have been thinking about. Is like, as a young practitioner who's just starting out in like computer graphics, or even someone who's in mid-career, what can we do to keep up with this advanced domain as a lifelong career? And even then, as kids, I think the follow-up question is, if you have kids who are just interested in starting out, what would you recommend? Would you have 3 things that you could recommend for reading or something that they could try out?
Boy, that's a tough one. I was watching a show on television this last Saturday, morning show, and there was a show about teaching girls how to learn STEM, and they were using animation to illustrate a point about inclusion and science and so forth. And the sad part was they were using tools that were really bad. I mean, okay. But that's the thing. I think, go back to my point earlier, there's a lot of smart people listening to this talk, I wish there's some way we can get people to build a new generation of tools that empower people to use computer graphics at every level, right? Not just the high end people who can afford it, not the big business, but every kids that come home from school can now suddenly get on the computer and visualize things using a simple set of tools. And we don't have that right now. And it's really been bugging me for a long time. I can tell many stories of how I try to get people to do that, but it's just not easy because it's hard to make money in that business. But we're really missing that, right?
It's really important. I know Pat Hanrahan is making a big push now to try to get better tools and better education for people in other situations. To get more women and minorities involved, and it requires actually a lot of work. And the interesting thing about it is that if the output is visual, then people are more intrigued. It's one of the cool things about animation or any graphics is you get a reward for having done something, and it's more gratifying if you've got it, because then people can share it. And it's that combination of I'm going to do something, I've got better tools to do it, and then I can show it to others and I can enjoy what I've made.
No, that totally makes. I think you cut off a little bit, but I think some of that made sense, or it most made sense. I think I'm going to pivot a little bit to a slightly different question, which I think is on the mind of a few folks. So, with the culture surrounding the innovations that are influencing CG, and in turn, like the stuff that CG is influencing in the world, such as the stuff that's been happening in AI in the early days, things that are happening in hardware. Like, how has the innovations of CG influenced kind of the culture of innovation itself, and kind of the industries that we have at large?
Well, one thing to note is that there are a lot of places where they focus on visualization. And in fact, it goes back to the thing that Richard started with is, he was trying to visualize something. And Pat Hanrahan did the same thing. He was trying to visualize something. And there are lots and lots of fields where trying to visualize something then actually gives them insights that they didn't have. It goes way beyond filmmaking or storytelling. It's how do you actually get something in your head which is hard to grab onto. And if you can make a picture and move it around, then you get an insight.
Complex information. Yeah. Because we deal with so much more information in everyday's life now. And ability to process that much information has become harder and harder. And, Pat's company did some amazing work for businesses in terms of visualizing large data. But we haven't moved to a point where now the average person now can visualize common things they deal with every day. I think I've seen some very interesting work in terms of how people are visualizing. Like, there's me and a bunch of friends been online the last month, pretty much, trying to figure out how people are visualizing the spread of coronavirus, right? And, it's still far from perfect because it's so clunky in some way, and because the process is still not easy.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. I think visualization is really interesting because it kind of merges UX and user experiences, user interfaces with computer graphics, which are inherently tied anyway. I guess the thing that I think we're almost running out of time, so I'm going to try and keep it to the last two questions that we have on our docket, but I think they're particularly interesting. I think one of the most fascinating things about your career is that you've done so many things. Like, both of you have achieved a lot and have really done a service to the greater computer graphics community. But it's also been very difficult. And I think a lot of people who are going through this right now are asking the same questions. Do you have any type of strategies to get through the tough stuff that's happening in your career? How do you cope with the naysayers who said, for example, that a full-length 3D animated film couldn't be achieved?
There's nothing you can't not achieve. It's just a matter of making it cost-effective enough that you can do it. And I think because I was involved with looking at studios around the world in the early 2000s, I saw a lot of sweatshops around the world. I didn't like that, right? Once you go into a place where you see people doing it just as a job, then it's just a job. To maintain an environment where you're constantly innovating, we require the management and the support that reinforce that. I mean, Ed had a team that, we can sit here and spend all day naming all the great people that worked in both places. But that environment has to be nurtured. And I think people need to look for that type of environment or build their own that have that ability to survive the long term. You can't just demand it. Yeah.
One of the things I think is important is when people come up to you with this comment that this can't be done, then you have to thank them, because what you do is you've got the thing to put on the list of one of the problems you got to solve. And that's what you have to think about it. If you can't do that, okay, that goes on the list. Yeah. Now I know what to work on. And other than that, I always felt, because I've heard a lot of people say you can't do that, and it's like, I don't care if they said that. It's not.
In fact, the more the better.
Yeah, it's just like they're just wrong. It's not a personal thing. It's just their view. But here's the problem. Okay, thank you.
Go back to what I said earlier. I mean, I still remember we had animator that wanted to leave PDI and go to Pixar, and Pixar has a lot of distinguished people. I always said to them, I said, look, they have really smart people, but I can tell you, even with us, between all of us, there's nothing we can't do, but it's all of us, and that's important. You can't do it all yourself. There's no way. I'm not the smartest guy. I always tell people, they ask me, what's your secret to success? I said, I'm not the smartest guy. There's a lot of really bright people. I dropped out of grad school, right? Well, but what's important is I make mistakes faster than anybody. I'm not afraid of making those mistakes, and that's important. And I can tell you, Ed, yeah.
Did we get the guy? The animator you're talking about. Did he stay with you, or did he come with us?
A lot of good ones went to you. We know. Yeah. And
yeah. Well, I'm gonna have a last question for both of you, which I think hopefully I think is a meaningful one. I think out of all your accomplishments, what are the ones that you're most proud of? And out of all the things where would you like to really see kind of the computer graphics industry go, or the community go toward, like, in the long term?
Oh, okay. I can go first.
You go first, all right.
Okay. For me, it's still what I said earlier, where when I run into ex-PDI, and they always said the thing they miss the most is not the technology, but really the team we had, the environment we built. And that allowed a lot of people to learn what they can of what we accomplish and move on with their life and improve their perspective and accomplish things they didn't think they thought they could accomplish. And for me, that was the most gratifying part of my recent years, running into people I used to work with, is that how much they value the supportive environment that we gave them and the opportunity they had to learn from that and excel beyond where when they left us. And that to me is very gratifying.
Yeah, I would add to that there was a shared goal, and the fact that we had a kind of community where we could share together to solve those problems was very meaningful to me, and those relationships as we worked together.
No, that's great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Like, I'm afraid we have run out of time. So I'd like to thank Ed and Richard again for their memorable discussion. Sorry, I'm like having a hard time speaking. Amazing stories and kind of like the insightful answers you've kind of given throughout the Q&A, really. Like, it was really, really fantastic. So a special thanks to each of you for taking the time to attend and participate today. This talk is recorded and will be available online in a few days at learning.acm.org. I know a few people have been asking that question. In addition to that, you can find announcements on our upcoming talks and other ACM activities at learning.acm.org and acm.org. In fact, our next one I think will be with Jeanette Wing, and that will be for data, which should be very exciting. So also, please fill out our quick survey where you can suggest future topics or speakers, which you should be able to see on your screen. So on behalf of AACM, Ed Catmull, Richard Chuang, and myself, Juan Miguel de Hoya, thanks again for joining us, and I hope you will join us again in the future. This concludes our talk.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.